Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar for the second series of the Medieval Mediterranean webinars co-organized, as you know, by the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean, the Woolf Institute, that is also kindly hosting virtually these events, but also the universities of Munich, Ghent, and the Medieval Research Studies University of Lincoln, and the Institut Milà and Fontanals CSIC in Barcelona. So before I introduce the chairs and speakers for today, just a brief reminder. I know that there are loads of friends here, I can see in the audience, of the Woolf Institute and the Society, but just briefly reminding everyone. So first of all, the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean is a society that is really into welcoming research in the study of medieval Mediterranean culture and history from the 5th to the 15th centuries. And the society has also got the journal Almasak, that I'm sure you are familiar with, or you might be interested in submitting your articles perhaps for consideration. And we also have a number of prizes to support in particular early career and postgraduate students, and last but not least, an international conference that runs every 2 years. And the forthcoming one in 2022 is in Crete, is about interruption and disruptions. And if you want to know more about the call for paper that is still open until the end of December, please do have a look at the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean website. As I also mentioned earlier, we are now kindly hosted by the Woolf Institute. Miriam Wagner cannot be here today, but on her behalf, I would like to welcome everyone and also remind everyone how what the Woolf Institute does, that is focusing on the research and understanding of relationships between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And the primary aim of the Woolf Institute is to answer practical and theoretical questions about identity, culture, and practice using very different multidisciplinary approaches with research, teaching, but also public engagement and education in kind of wide range of academic backgrounds. So before I move on to introduce the chair for this session, who will then introduce the speakers, I would like to remind everyone how this works for those of you who might attend for the first time one of our webinars. So this is at the moment live streamed on Facebook, and is also recorded, and the entire session lasts an hour. So the recording will stop at 7 p.m. However, if there are questions, and we can continue and go on for a few more minutes after that. Speaking of questions, so after our speakers will present their research, there will be time for the audience to engage with debate and ask questions, but please do so by including your questions in the Q&A. If you see at the bottom of your screen, you should see an icon that says Q&A. Please include your questions there rather than in the chat, because otherwise it becomes difficult to follow an order, understand who has answered what, and so forth. So thank you in advance for that. Finally, so I'm going to introduce the chair of this session, who's also a good friend of the Society, and is Dr. Mike Carr from the University of Edinburgh, although his t-shirt doesn't suggest that he's in Edinburgh, but we believe you are in very cold Edinburgh at the moment. So Mike is, well, as you might know, his research that really includes different types of relationships, including the Byzantine, Islamic world in the Mediterranean. And when you look at the range of his publications that cover those aspects, are many. In particular, his book, Merchant Crusaders in the Aegean, from the late 13th century to the mid 14th century. And Mike is a big fan of papacy as well. At the moment, I know he's got a new interesting project going on that maybe he might want to briefly mention. But most importantly, thank you in advance, Mike, for sharing this session. So to you.
Thanks so much, Antonella, and thank you for inviting me to chair the session. It's a real honour, and it's my first experience of one of these webinars, so I'm very much looking forward to it. And just to answer your question, yes, I am wearing a t-shirt, but I'm actually sat in my kitchen with an Arga behind me, so it's quite warm. But Edinburgh is absolutely freezing at the moment, so it's not the usual attire for going outside. Anyway, today we've got three really interesting speakers. So what I'll do is I'll introduce our three speakers, and then I'll hand over for the presentations. So first of all, we have Dr. Francesca Petruzzo, who is currently based at the Institute for Medieval Studies at the University of Leeds, and was previously a Leverhulme study abroad postdoc at the Università di Roma, where she investigated life and cultural legacy of Tancred of Hauteville, amongst other things. Francesca has several very interesting publications, both out and also forthcoming. For example, a forthcoming monograph in Routledge's Ruler of the Latin East series on Tancred, the lives and afterlife of a Hauteville crusader. Also several articles on Tancred and the Hautevilles in Medieval Prosopography and the Haskins Society Journal, and forthcoming articles in the JMH Crusades and Journal of Medieval Military History. Then our second speaker today is Dr. Andrew Buck, who is currently a Government of Ireland postdoctoral fellow at the University College Dublin, working on a project called Creating Outremer, William of Tyre and the Writing of History in the Latin East. And this is one of a number of projects Andrew's working on which relate to William of Tyre's Chronicon and wider processes of historical writing in the Latin East. Andrew has a very extensive publication record, including many articles in very reputable journals such as Viator, the JMH, Journal of Ecclesiastical History, and so forth. But probably his most important publication is his monograph published by Boydell in 2017 on the Principality of Antioch and its frontiers in the 12th century. And Andrew also has a forthcoming speculum article on the text attributed to Lysiard of Tours. Then our final speaker today is Dr. Stephen Spencer, who is currently a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at King's College London, working on a project titled Information, Dissemination and Contested Memory, the Third Crusade from 1187 to 1300. Stephen's first book, Emotions in a Crusading Context, 1095 to 1291, published by OUP in 2019, was the runner-up for the 2021 Dionysius Aegeus Prize, which is administered here by the Society of the Medieval Mediterranean. Stephen has an article forthcoming in the English Historical Review in 2022, which argues for redating of the Itinerarium Peregrinorum et Agesta Regis Ricardi. And he's also editing a collection of essays with Andrew Buck and James Kane on Crusade settlement and historical writing in the Latin East and Latin West. And that's forthcoming with Boydell and Brewer's Crusading in Context series. Okay, so that's enough from me. So I think I'll pass over to the first of our speakers today, which is Dr. Francesca Petruzzo.
Thank you very much for this, and thank you very much for having me. And today, as I believe that the webinar description said, I will be talking about the memories of crusading in southern Italy, which is, of course, quite a knot in the sources because the Normans in the south, using the name by which they're normally known, are very prominent in the First Crusade and the conquest of Jerusalem, with the contingent led by Bohemond and Tancred. Bohemond is instrumental in the capture of Antioch, then Tancred is instrumental in the capture of Jerusalem, passing in the service of Godfrey of Bouillon. But after the First Crusade, the engagement from southern Italy becomes much, much smaller, and we have had great contributions that I'm sure will be ongoing. But today, what I'm going to look at is the way that memories of crusading in southern Italy, I believe, speak to a specific aspect of this, which is the memories of crusading in southern Italy, as I will go to show, hopefully go to show today, are both intensely local and very focused on the Hautevilles, which are the ruling family on southern Italy, which I think goes in a sense to explain why crusading is not perceived as a movement for which people are recruited, because it is perceived very much as an enterprise that the Hautevilles start and lead. And as the case study that I am using today is this book, which is the Historia de Via et Recuperazione Antiochiaque Hierosolumarum, also known as the Historia Belli Sacri. Now, among the Latin sources for the First Crusade, the Historia de Via has been somewhat less studied. I am actually currently making its first full translation. There's a partial translation in Italian, but there hasn't been full translation in English yet. And that is because actually the Historia de Via very much essentially builds on and almost entirely, for the greatest majority, cleaves very close to Ralph of Caen's Gesta Tancredi, which is of course in itself a very peculiar source for the First Crusade. And what's interesting about this is that has sort of led to ignore a little bit the Historia de Via. But when we look closer, we actually see that the Historia de Via embodies a very interesting knot in the memories of crusading in southern Italy. Now, as far as we can tell, the Historia de Via is a product of Monte Cassino, which is one of the greatest monasteries of medieval Italy. And Monte Cassino is basically halfway between southern Italy and Rome. It is in a very important geographical spot, and it is an absolute, at this point, economic and intellectual powerhouse. It has, in particular, a very flourishing production of chronicle writing, among it the Monte Cassino Chronicle, which is extremely extensive work of chronicling, and it is probably there that the Historia de Via is written, compiled between 1130 and 1153, as far as we can tell from context clues. And it is in fact also closely then inserted in the Monte Cassino Chronicle itself for what concerns the section dealing with the First Crusade. And because it basically follows very closely the Gesta Tancredi, the Historia de Via is essentially a source that stays close to the southern Italian contingent during the First Crusade. And indeed, while it borrows all over the place, the thing that it borrows the most of from Ralph of Caen is the Gesta Francorum, although of course everybody borrows from the Gesta Francorum. But what's really interesting about this then is that between 1130 and 1154, we have this abbey in southern Italy, which gets a copy of the exceedingly rare Gesta Tancredi and then rewrites it, incorporating some additional information from the local place. And then there is a copy there and then a partial copy in France. So the audience for this is very small. And it's interesting because, of course, we have somebody working in a southern abbey, and they are taking a work written by somebody from Normandy who has served in Antioch and written about his time in Antioch. So actually, we are seeing this intriguing pipeline of texts between Outremer and France and southern Italy. But with all this, of course, this is very limited because we only have one copy, and we don't really have evidence that people use this. Because, and I think this makes a lot more sense once we see how other chronicles from southern Italy talk about the First Crusade. Because of course, the way that recruitment works for the First Crusade in southern Italy, Geoffrey Malaterra, who is a chronicler working for Roger, Count of Sicily, tells us, is that the call for the East comes as Bohemond, who is the nephew of Count Roger of Sicily, is helping him besiege the city of Amalfi. Bohemond decides to join the crusade because Geoffrey Malaterra tells us he wants to continue to pursue the campaigns against the Byzantine Empire that his father Robert Guiscard pursued. And then he basically recruits away the youngest and most promising knights in southern Italy, and off he goes. And this is essentially how the story gets told in Geoffrey Malaterra, in the pseudo Romuald of Salerno chronicle that borrows from him, and then later, and then in Lupus Protus Batarius, who is another contemporary chronicler in southern Italy. So the attitude to this is, there was a thing from outside of Italy, and it took away a bunch of very promising knights from southern Italy itself, but it didn't concern them. There is this feeling that it is a very external event, and that a very local, very popular leader, the son of Robert Guiscard, decided to take part. He recruited knights, and they left. But that's really as far as it goes. And what's really interesting is that the Storia de Via tries to correct this, because the Storia de Via opens with these highly literary descriptions of the portents and prodigies that engulf Europe, and this sort of a feeling of awakening in very classic, shall we say, millenarian crusading Breton tradition that invests Europe. But that is all in Europe, because when we get to southern Italy, we again get to the point that Bohemond decides to leave, recruits knights, and leaves. And in my research, I have spent a lot of time puzzling about this and trying to move away from the age-old questions, are the Southern Italians bad crusaders? Which I don't feel is a very helpful question to ask. You know, they go on the First Crusade, then they don't go on other crusades. Why? And I think that what the Storia de Via shows us is that there is an awareness that the Southern Italian contingent can be talked about, can be depicted in a very classic European, Northern European fashion, as having taken part in this great concourse of barons that decide to go east. And there are attempts at bringing this perspective in southern Italy. There are attempts because they've clearly imported the text of Ralph of Caen, and they have clearly compiled it into the Monte Cassino Chronicle. But it is not a successful attempt. And I think that what is happening here, and I think what's really crucial to look at, is that even though the Storia de Via is very different from other Southern Crusading chronicles, because it actually celebrates crusading in the way that crusading is celebrated in other parts of Europe, claiming this very prestigious pilgrimage in arms that these Southern Italian lords have gone on, it does not really make an attempt to recruit for further crusades. It is looking back at Bohemond, it is looking back at Tancred, it is looking back at the Southern Italians who have led this crusader expedition. It celebrates them in a very highly literary fashion, but it doesn't really go further than that. And I think what's really interesting is that when we look at what's happening at the time in which probably this is being formed, this is the time of the rise of Roger II to become King of Sicily. And of course, Roger II several times attempted to involve himself with Outremer. His mother married King Baldwin. He made a serious bid a few years later for Antioch. But again, it was Roger II doing this. So it is very interesting. Of course, we cannot answer whether this is the kind of patronage that the writer had in mind. But what I think is very interesting here is that we are seeing the memory of some Southern Italian leaders going on crusade being written about at the time in which another Southern Italian leader is talking about being involved in Outremer. And so what we are looking at here is a memory of crusading that is still alive, but it is still very, very close to the interests of the ruling family, who are clearly the ones that are going to be in charge of a crusader expedition, should there be a further one. And so in this sense, I think the Storia de Via brings together very many interesting things. It brings together the potential for cosmopolitanism of southern Italy at this point, because they are clearly in contact with scriptoria in Outremer, in France. They have an interest and they have an awareness of it. But they also remain intensely local. They are talking about this in the view of the local ruling family, and they are looking at this in a context in which perhaps a pitch is being made. But if it is being made, it is still at the same level at which the chronicler is speaking about this, and so the level of those who led the first crusade from southern Italy. And so to conclude, I think that it is very interesting how these in fact lingered, because of course after Roger II, we do not we see that there is this failure to gain a foothold in Outremer. And this memory of crusading tied to the local leaders then remains there, and poses itself in contrast and break to the rest of Europe, and so essentially argues for what is the very contextual and I think very fascinating in the sense landscape of southern Italy, a place where Bohemond was buried, and the rest of Europe remembers Bohemond as the conqueror of Antioch, one of the most famous of the leaders of the First Crusade, and the crusade is not in fact even mentioned on his mausoleum. And I think I'm at the end of my 10 minutes, so I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you very much, Francesca. Excellent timekeeping as well, bang on 10 minutes. That was really fascinating. So yeah, thanks so much for that. What we'll do is we'll pass on now to Andrew and hear his presentation, and then Stephen, and we'll do the Q&A at the end. So Andrew, if you'd like to give us your presentation, that'd be great.
Thank you, Mike. And again, I'd like to express thanks for the invite, and also how happy I am to be part of an event that's in part celebrating Stephen's book. So my paper is going to be slightly a bit more theoretical. Or I'm going to have a waffle for the first bit, and then I'll talk about the Latin East. So, in recent decades, the field of Crusade studies has flourished. Indeed, it can sometimes be hard to move at medieval conferences without bumping into someone who has at some stage published on Crusading or is publishing on Crusading. Like any other field, moreover, it has witnessed trends and changes, though the impulsive drive towards empiricism to consider what happened and why has remained forever present. Nevertheless, in recent years, the desire to better understand the cultural imprint caused by the Crusading movement in medieval Europe has risen to the fore in a way that it perhaps has never quite done so previously, and this may well be linked to modern appropriations of the Crusades by white supremacist groups and elsewhere. But what's emerged from this then is the realization that Crusading left a deep and lasting impression on, and was in turn influenced by, wider processes and practices of, amongst other things, religion, dynasty creation, knighthood, and literary creation. Not only has this been identified by scholars of the traditional region of so-called Western Europe, there's the British Isles, France, the Low Countries, and Germany, also those of Iberia, and as we just heard, Italy, as well as Scandinavia and the broader Eastern European region. Importantly, such developments have not only sounded a warning to any enduring believers that the field of Crusade studies can, or indeed does, sit outside of the wider study of medieval history. They have also irrevocably changed the ways in which scholars approach their sources, and indeed the sources they approach. Most especially, the sources for the Crusades are now more overtly considered as cultural artifacts, as windows onto the societies from which they emerged, and as enduring legacies of the identities and memories they were created to construct and transmit. And this is not limited to historical writings, which have long been the lifeblood of historiography. For any scholar of the Crusading movement must now incorporate into their arsenal such diverse materials as Crusading chansons, the songs of troubadours and trouvères, papal letters, liturgical texts, artworks, and myriad other forms of material culture. And I'm sure I've missed some things out which people are shouting at their own screens currently. Nevertheless, while the works of scholars like Marcus Bull, Nicholas Paul, Anne Leicester, Cecilia Gaposchkin, Catherine Ann Smith, the members of this panel, just to name a small sample, have widened the scholarly horizon regarding the Crusading cultures of the Latin West, the Latin East, that is the term often used alongside those of Outremer and the Crusader states to describe the polities formed in the wake of the First Crusade at the turn of the 12th century, has yet to be fully incorporated into such discussions. Such is the case that in a recent 2018 volume of this society's journal, Al-Masak, Christopher McKevitt argued that because there was, in his eyes at least, no active or rhetorical memorialization of the crusading past in the Frankish East, and nor did settlers take crusading vows when fighting their Muslim enemies, then the term Crusader state should be considered a misnomer and eschewed by scholars. Now, the impulses behind this move are laudatory. Indeed, they reflect a desire to move beyond imperialist historiographical superstructures and to see the Latin East as more a part of the East than of the Latin. However, they are, I would argue, and have argued, misleading and risk anachronism. As such, I published a response to McKevitt in the English Historical Review in 2020, in which I argued that, in fact, the processes of crusading remembrance and identity creation that scholars have witnessed across medieval Europe was similarly present in the Latin East, and seen not only in historical texts, but in liturgical celebrations, letters, coins, religious iconography, poetry, buildings, inscriptions, oral vernacular cultures, and naming patterns. It's quite a long article. Now, perhaps they manifested in different ways than elsewhere, but they were there nevertheless. Therefore, I suggested not only should the term Crusader states endure, but we should be willing to consider what these polities might tell us about crusading as a cultural phenomenon. Now, it's not my intention to regurgitate this article, for it's available to anyone with a subscription to an academic library, the correct address for Sci-Hub, or any other means of getting things off the internet. And I'm happy to share a PDF with anyone who wants to contact me. Rather, I will dedicate the rest of my short talk to discussing the ways in which I continue to explore the crusading cultures of the Latin East in my current and future research. So, as was noted at the start, the focus of my current studies is the Chronicon, or the Historia Hieronymitana of Archbishop William of Tyre. His is a name that will be familiar to some of you here at least, but just in case, I will briefly introduce him. So William was born in Jerusalem, circa 1130. He then spent some 20 years in the schools of Paris, Orleans and Bologna between 1145 and 1165 before returning to Outremer. He quickly rose to prominence at the Jerusalemite court and within the church, serving as ambassador to Byzantium, tutor to the royal heir Baldwin IV, chancellor of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and Archbishop of Tyre. He personally witnessed the turbulent decades of the kingdom as it hurtled towards disaster at the hands of Saladin, but he died in around 1184, 1185, and so did not witness the Holy Land's eventual fall. The Chronicon, which is William's magnum opus, is an account of the Latin East leading from the summoning of the First Crusade through to 1184. Importantly, as it serves as the only surviving internal written witness to events in the Latin East between 1127 and 1184, it has become what Marcus Bull might call the indispensable rhythm track for those looking to reconstruct and understand events in Outremer during those years. An unfortunate side effect of this, however, is it has caused historians to largely jettison William's coverage of earlier events, most especially the First Crusade. Indeed, so the argument goes in several publications, including regrettably one of my own, as these parts of the Chronicon are reliant on certain other written texts and are also deeply removed from the period in question, then they lack any empirical value and even offer very little in the way of insight into William's authorial voice. Now, I will not challenge the form of these criticisms, for there is little value in doing so. However, this latter trend requires and rewards close attention. Thus, my current research has not only focused on revealing William's historical method by deconstructing the means by which he utilized, edited, and expanded upon the sources he had at his disposal, particularly for the First Crusade, the corpus of which is much larger than previous scholars have assumed, but more importantly, as regards the current discussion, it has also revealed once more the profound cultural undercurrents of crusading that existed in the Latin East, and how, even in the later decades of the 12th century, these underpinned the Frankish cultures of Outremer. Due to time constraints, I can't go into too much detail, but two overarching points are worth making. Firstly, that William's account of the First Crusade is testament to the survival of and interest in a wide array of crusading narratives in the East. For it appears that William was able to draw upon nearly all of the main surviving narrative histories we have for the Crusade, some of which are rather surprising, while he perhaps also had others which have not survived to us. Moreover, that such texts were preserved in libraries in the Holy Land, and that William sought to add to them with his own work, demonstrate at the very least that there was a perceived readership amongst Outremer's educated elites for stories of the First Crusade. The second and surprisingly controversial point is that the Chronicon lends further testament to the knowledge of and preservation of crusading chansons in Outremer. Most especially, in addition to William's own comment that stories of Godfrey of Bouillon's exploits were still told in his time, it is demonstrably clear that William engaged with the chanson d'Antioche. This engagement is extended beyond the simple preservation of detail, however. Thus, while covering events at Antioch during the Crusade, William adopted and incorporated methods of oral storytelling, including the use of gestures, humor, narratorial foregrounding, reported speech, and emotion that not only mimicked the form of a chanson, but in doing so likewise preserved the culture of storytelling and information sharing that scholars have emphasized as vital to the the creation and transmission of the Crusades' history, even during the campaign itself. By evoking the feel of the so-called campfire cultures, that William therefore did more than simply tell the history of the venture, he also drew his audiences into the oral crusading communities from which these stories first emerged, and to which many settlers could trace their heritage. The aim of this, I would suggest, would be to inspire his audiences to emulate the deeds of their forebears. Finally, as a very short coda, I wanted to mention an early product of a wider project proceeding from my William of Tyre work, which traces wider processes of medieval historical writing on the Latin East. Thus, I have been researching a little-known short history of Jerusalem's kings, probably produced in the Holy Land in the 1190s, following the failure of the Third Crusade. Significantly, not only does this text trace the reigns of each monarch up to he who lost Jerusalem itself, Guy of Lusignan, it proceeds most especially from an account of the First Crusades that sets up Godfrey of Bouillon as both the first ruler and a Christ-like God-sent beacon of emulation. This, like William's text, thus stands as a testament to the enduring legacy of that initial venture and the potent influence it held as a vehicle for identity creation and myth-making in the Latin East, much as it did in the Latin West. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Another fascinating paper. So now I'll just hand over to Stephen, who's going to finish off with his presentation.
Thanks, Mike. I have a very short PowerPoint, but I will just share now. So hopefully you can see that. So thank you very much for the invitation to talk in the session. To my mind, there are two ways in which current scholarship on the topic of the Crusades and memory might be developed further. The first is through greater and overt engagement with the field of memory studies. So briefly, my own research on the memorialization of the Third Crusade in Western Europe before circa 1300 responds to the work of Jan Assmann on collective memory, Geoffrey Cubitt on contested memory, and the associated concept of local memory. But this evening, I would like to focus on the second avenue of inquiry, that is the expansion of the source space, which historians have utilized to investigate crusading memory. Specifically, this paper explores the value of a genre which continues to be marginalized. The numerous sets of annals, chronologically arranged brief notes on the significant events of each year, usually commencing with the Incarnation, that were produced throughout the British Isles during the 12th and 13th centuries. Now, though annalistic texts have been fruitfully mined in the broader field of medieval studies, they have rarely been integrated into studies of the Crusades, with the notable exception of Catherine Hurlock's work on Welsh and Irish annals. I'll start by discussing some broad trends, and I can only provide a snapshot here. The brevity of this type of source material, which is usually regarded as a major deficiency, is as much an advantage as a disadvantage. For short annalistic texts offer a unique panoramic perspective, allowing the historian to appreciate the place and significance of the Third Crusade in the wider context of British, European, and sometimes world history. Examination of a wide range of annals has revealed that the Third Crusade was eclipsed by the events that bookended it. Annalists paid far greater attention to the expedition's causes and consequences than to the crusade itself, resulting in detailed commentaries for the years 1187 to 88 and 1193 to 94, but terser entries for 1190 to 92. I would argue that for many professed religious across Britain, the Third Crusade was relevant primarily because it resulted in King Richard I of England's year-long imprisonment, following his capture by Duke Leopold of Austria in December 1192, because this directly impinged on their lives and communities. So as you can see in the manuscript on my title page, Richard's capture and delivery to Emperor Henry VI is the only event listed under 1192 in the Annals of St. Paul's, London, and the significance attached to this event is surely reflected in its repetition in the obits for both Leopold and Henry, making Richard's imprisonment the core narrative element of this section. Others were more verbose, issuing what are tantamount to bitter complaints. Abbeys and other churches were stripped of their treasures and precious stones, wrote an annalist based in Waverley, Surrey, and the Cistercian monasteries, which lacked such possessions, were forced to surrender a year's worth of wool. And we find this a lot. This was the story of 1193. Turning to the events of the Third Crusade itself, annalistic texts are important evidence for the dissemination of certain ideas about the Crusade, most notably that it was hamstrung by the reluctant French, and they simultaneously suggest that through selective reporting and subtle omissions, some annals were carefully constructed to create a narrative of success. So one method of achieving this was to focus on a few select events, especially the conquest of Cyprus and the capture of Acre in 1191, while ignoring others. Indeed, at times, the capture of Acre, often portrayed as being divinely ordained, appears to stand for the entire crusade, implying that it was an unambiguous success. Following detailed entries down to 1190, Acre's fall is the only event of the crusade itself included in the annals of Margam Abbey. Given that this is immediately preceded by an account of a solar eclipse dated to the 23rd of June 1191, it's not difficult to imagine readers making a connection between these two events. In fact, we can trace the Margam Annals' influence over another set of 13th century annals assembled at the Cistercian Abbey of Dore in Hertfordshire. Here, the account of Richard's departure in 1190 was extended to report that he captured the island of Cyprus and the cities of Acre and Ascalon, thereby making the enterprise appear even more successful. Yet annals also bear witness to the diverse array of interpretations of the expedition that were formulated across medieval Britain, many of which appear to possess a local character. This can take the form of affording greater prominence to Crusaders who are bit part players in the participant narratives. For instance, there seems to have existed a tradition centering on the Crusade participation of the Earls of Leicester, Robert III and his son, Robert IV. An obit for Robert III appears in the Annals of Waverley, as well as the work known as the Crowland Chronicle, but the Earls received greater prominence in the chronicle preserved in British Library manuscript Harley 3775, which was probably compiled in Coventry Cathedral Priory. So you can see on the slide, after all, Coventry is only 23 miles from Leicester, and the text's considerable interest in the Earls of Leicester hints at a possible connection to the Abbey of St Mary of the Meadows in Leicester, which was founded as an Augustinian house by Robert II in 1143. So you can see on the slide that Robert III's departure of his retinue for Jerusalem was the subject of a marginal addition in the annal for 1190, while that for 1194 details the capture of Robert IV by the French and his imprisonment. 1196 narrates his release and return to England, quote, the first time after his return from Jerusalem. So the Crusade participation of the Earls of Leicester forms a recurring and coherent narrative thread for the early 1190s. We also find original interpretations of events. To take the Coventry Chronicle as an example again, this work is marked by an unusual emphasis on the close collaborative relationship between Richard and Philip Augustus, King of France, in their preparations for the Crusade. Under 1188, the annals record that Richard submitted to the authority of the King of France and did homage to him. Richard's status as vassal frames and explains his crusade participation. There is no mention of his taking the cross. Instead, following his coronation in September 1189, Richard embarked on the crusade because he was commanded to do so by Philip. You can see that in the first quote. The entry for 1190 then opens with a unique scene of communal grief, whereby the two kings were both afflicted by immense grief, Philip because of the death of Queen Isabel of France, Richard over the passing of his brother-in-law, King William II of Sicily. And this shared sorrow compelled them to delay the pilgrimage. As Paul Hayward has argued, the presentation of Philip and Richard's harmonious relationship indicates that this section is very likely of an early date, for it was penned without knowledge that their relationship deteriorated at Messina in September 1190. Perhaps most importantly of all, we occasionally catch glimpses of the ways in which the Third Crusade impacted upon local religious houses beyond the financial ruin manifested by the king's captivity, and distinctive ways in which those communities remembered the enterprise. A striking example of this comes from the Annals of Battle Abbey, which under 1200 recorded that King John gave a certain small piece of the sepulchre of the Lord to the Church of Battle, which his brother Richard had brought back with other relics. It can be inferred from this brief entry that the translation of relics was an important and tangible consequence of the Third Crusade, as it was, of course, for the Fourth Crusade on a much larger scale, and one which directly impacted upon the months of battle. But to conclude, annalistic chronicles deserve to be incorporated more fully into Crusade studies, not least because they offer a significantly different lens through which to consider the topic of the memorialization of the Crusades. These texts attest that a coherent, widely disseminated, and universally understood interpretation of the Third Crusade did not exist in medieval Britain, at least not before 1300. There was a tendency to overlook or downplay the expedition, the loss of the relic of the True Cross and Jerusalem, and the imprisonment of Richard I were the major stories of the 1180s and 1190s, not the Third Crusade. On the other hand, some of the expedition's events appear in a sufficiently large number of annals to suggest that they were deemed worthy of remembrance and had become part of wider cultural memory in medieval Britain. This is especially the case with the conquest of Cyprus and the capture of Acre, around which narratives of success could be crafted. But we also find diversity of opinion and local interpretations through unusual emphases on specific individuals, original depictions of events, and nuggets of information which provide snapshots of the Crusades' impact on local religious communities. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Stephen. Another really interesting paper. So yeah, I think now it's time for Q&A. So as Antonella mentioned at the beginning of the session, if you could just put in any of your questions into the Q&A function, that'll be excellent. And then what we'll do is we'll work through them as and when they come up. And I can see there's one that's come up here. So from Carr Ferrugia. So what I'll do is I'll read it out and then hand it over to the speakers to address. So Carl says, regarding crusading activity in southern Italy, how possible is it that the conquest of Sicily from the Fatimids, Chalcidids, and the later establishment of the Norman Kingdom of Africa were in themselves seen as analogous to the crusading activities? Considering that the Reconquista in Spain was framed as an equally valid crusading effort by Pope Pascal II, and the conquest of Lisbon being seen as part of the Second Crusade, do later sources make any references to this to say that the Hauteville's successful conquest of Sicily and North Africa were therefore effectively a crusade? So I think, Francesca, that's probably the one best aimed at you. So if you could, yeah, have a go at answering that, that'd be fantastic.
Yes, so the answer is not at all, basically. So I think that he's, especially in the 19th century, we had this very imperialist and very romanticized idea of the basically the clash, as it would have been described. But this was not at all what southern Italy looked like at the time. It is, and this could be, you know, enormous. It is in fact monographs, but to make it as brief as possible. So the conquest of Sicily was very piecemeal at the time in which it was taken over, over the latter part of the 11th century. Actually, the Chalcid Emirate had broken down into civil war. First, the Normans in the south went there as mercenaries for the Byzantine, surviving Byzantine power in southern Italy to reconquer it for Byzantium. And then Robert Guiscard and his brother Roger were first hired by a local Muslim warlord, Ibn al-Tunna, to be his mercenaries. And it is from there that they start conquering Sicily, which takes about 30 years. And when they are fighting in Sicily, now the main source here is Geoffrey Malaterra, and Geoffrey Malaterra can be very confusing as to who he refers to when he's talking about the Sicilians. But they are in fact sometimes fighting with and sometimes fighting against Muslims from North Africa, Muslims from Sicily, Greeks from Sicily. Italians from Sicily, who are probably Latin speakers, but that's precise as I can be about it. And in fact, far from being perceived as an crusade, which some people, for example, most prominently Sheveden, have argued for, if anything, it creates a very complex environment in which the Normans from the south actually know and fight alongside Muslims. When Bohemond answers the call to crusade, he has been besieging Amalfi with his uncle Roger and with his uncle Roger's armies. According to the Historia de Via, both Tancred and his cousin Richard of the Principate speak Arabic. And something that I write about a lot is that during the conquest of Jerusalem itself, Tancred, possibly with Gaston de Bern, is the only crusader to spare civilians. He gives them his banner for protection on the rooftop of the temple. And what I theorize is because he doesn't see the purpose in the slaughter of non-Christians beyond the necessity for war, because he's probably able to speak with them, and he comes from a place, I think, an expression that I use a lot, that I take from Thomas's writing and his book, The English and the Normans, is the pragmatic tolerance of the Normans, which is that the Normans in the south are interested in taking over. Sometimes they ask conversion of the local Muslim warlord because they are interested in separating him from his co-religionaries. But that's as far as it goes. Indeed, Geoffrey Malaterra has this sort of a funny bit in which the local warlord swears fealty to Roger. Roger says, why don't you convert to Christianity to show me that you mean it? And this man says, yes, but my wife is my cousin and you Christians don't permit that. And Roger's like, it's fine. We can get dispensation from that. So yes, so my answer would be that I don't really see that. Sometimes it is referred to, but in a very throwaway fashion. And indeed, the last thing that I will say is that William of Apulia, who is this writer in verse of the Gesta Roberto Giscardi, writes this poem that is dedicated to Urban II, and he mentions holy war in southern Italy in 2 lines. Throw away, then doesn't mention it again. And I feel like that really speaks volumes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Francesca. Does anyone else have any other questions for our panelists? I mean, Andrew, yeah, do you want to fire away?
I actually have a question for Francesca, and it's quite a selfish one, but I haven't seen you in ages, so I'm going to ask it anyway. I was interested, so the Historia de Via I find really interesting, and one of the reasons, well, the question I've really got is, why do you think it has the Peter the Hermit bit at the start? Because it's one of only 5 histories of the First Crusade which gives Peter the Hermit the kind of start off bit for the First Crusade, and I wonder what memory of crusading or what vision of crusading is the author of this Historia de Via trying to create by including a story which isn't in, as far as aware, their source material. And I can understand why some of the other sources have. I still don't really understand why the Historia de Via adds it. One of the reasons I thought maybe it's because he's meant to have passed through Apulia and maybe they met him, or I don't know, but I would be interested to know your thoughts.
So that's really interesting, and this actually ties into something that I'm actually writing a paper on, the way that the Historia de Via tackles the supernatural. So the answer for that would be that it actually depends on the way the chronicles are written about in Monte Cassino. So Monte Cassino has this very, for lack of a better word, ecclesiastical standpoint on things. So the Monte Cassino Chronicle is very keen on portents and miracles and prayer and saints. And indeed, it's very remarkable that nearly like many of the instances of the, shall we say, I hesitate to say supernatural, but ultranatural, portentous events that are in the Historia de Via are actually part of the original writing. So I think that when you're writing from Monte Cassino and you're setting out to write this history about your southern Italian rulers going east, actually the story of how all this may start from the vision, which is very vivid. You are right, it is a very vivid moment, because he actually describes it, the hermit going and lying down and having a dream in which God says, you must cleanse the land and all that, I think it fits with this overall event, that this pilgrimage, because he sees it as a pilgrimage. He sees it, he has a very distinctive style. I think the Storia di Via, a great disservice has been done to it by, stressing how he follows along with Ralph of Cannes. He absolutely does, but he has his own voice. And a big part of this voice is, this is a pilgrimage. This is a moment of wonders in which people are called and they go across. And so Peter the Hermit fits in this, and that's why it's so seamlessly then included into the Monte Cassino Chronicle. And of course the question is it the same person doing both? So yeah.
Great, thank you very much, Francesca. Any other questions from anyone? I mean, I've got a few, but I'm sure other people have far better questions than I do. But actually, Andrew, if I could just ask you, during your presentation, you mentioned, very briefly, that obviously William Matthias has access to, sort of the major First Crusade narratives that when he was writing his own history. And you said in possibly some unknown, some ones which have now been lost. Can you tell us any more about that? Like, is it, to what extent can we reconstruct any information about these, or is it literally just fleeting references here and there? Yeah,
well, one of the things is with William's approach to sources, he very rarely just copies and pastes out of his text. So I think when the edition was being made, Huygens and Meyer focused on just finding very direct ways in which he sourced. But what really is the case with William is that he has clearly read very widely on the Crusade and then draws ideas and information. So one of the things that hasn't been stressed before, that he knew Ralph of Caen. I mean, it seems quite silly to think that a text written in Jerusalem, William wouldn't know about it. I think there's some interesting parallels with William's account of Peter the Hermit and the one in the Historia de Via, which I'm currently looking through. Another one which took me very by surprise is the interpolations by the Charleville poet into Gillot of Paris, the accounts of Edessa, the taking of Edessa, and some of the ways the city is described are very, very similar, probably closer than sometimes even William gets with someone like with Albert of Aachen, who is known as one of his main sources. So there are, I think he has access to a large corpus of material. The problem is that he could be a very selective historian. Therefore, it can be very slow to trace. And you really do have to go very closely through not just his words, but the way he constructs the story, the pacing, the style, the biblical quotations, the biblical references, to really see how he's doing. I mean, when I first started my postdoc, I thought I would write a new book on William Matthias' Chronicle, the monster that is that book, which is about 1,000 pages in the modern critical edition. And really, I found that even just sitting through the first 8 books, his account of the First Crusade, will be enough for a monograph, and understanding him as a historian, actually just seeing, because you can really see in a way you can't with the later material, the way his mind works and the way he's taking these stories, taking this material and then constructing his own very distinct narrative. And one of the things I've really found interesting with it as well, his use of the Bible is far more interesting and unique than other people have suggested. So he's kind of he's got the bare bones, the structures of other people's stories, and then creating his own one out of it. And I think his access to sources is very, very large. Whether or not it's all in the Latinese or he read some while he's in Europe. One of the things that's interesting about the Gillot of Paris, or the Charleville poet connection, is there's potentially a link to someone who he learned with in Paris. But there's a lot of work I need to do on that, but there's enough there to chase some interesting parallels, basically.
Thanks so much. That's really interesting. I mean, I think it's just a testament to the amount of detail and what you can really uncover from, such an extensive and detailed source when you really dig into it. So it's fascinating. I have a very quick question for Francesca. This is just born from my own ignorance. The Historia de Via, I can't say I'd actually heard of it before you gave your presentation. Could you were there many different manuscript variants? Was it well sort of circulated? How was it received and stuff?
No, not at all. So there is a manuscript in Monte Cassino itself, and there is half a manuscript compiled in France. But then, of course, the Leicester and Tancredi only survives in one manuscript. So it's very clearly, right, the zone of interest of the Hautevilles, so that there is one text about the Hautevilles. There is a place that's interested in them, and it receives them. But I think it's really striking because the Gesta Francorum, right, which is, to cite John Franz, has infected every version of the the First Crusade that we have is produced by somebody who is in the following of Bohemond. So the southern Italian contingent in the First Crusade is there. But actually you get to southern Italy and you find that they're not as interested on the whole. And actually what I have found writing family history, because I started from the family history of the Hautevilles, is that there is far more detail in chronicles outside southern Italy than in southern Italy itself. The Gesta Francorum doesn't even say that Bohemond and Tancred are related at all. And you know, it's the question, is he even interested, or is this just so self-evident because he knows these people? Yeah, no, as far as I can see, at some point somebody who was doing this work of history writing came into contact with Ralph of Caen's text, thought it was very good, thought it suited the historiographical aims that were being cultivated at Monte Cassino. What I was telling Andrew in relation to his question, I do think that the Historia de Via does something very specifically tied to it. But it is also very rich in detail in that, for example, when it ends, you know, he has this bit where he says, you know, and Tancred swore to return Antioch to the children of Bohemond. It is just like, nobody would say that in Outremer, because everybody's very clear in Outremer that once Bohemond has left and you're not moving Tancred. But it is very much a southern detail, because southern chronicles do keep track of which Hauteville leaves something to which other Hauteville, and indeed Romuald of Salerno says, and then Tancred died, to whom Antioch had been left. So yeah, no, to bring it together, it's very local, and it's not very popular outside of it. And I wonder, but you know, it's a hypothesis, I can't prove it, if the reason why there's one in France is because you have this exchange in which Monte Cassino gets the manuscript of the Gesta Tancredi, and then they send up the Historia de Via. But there's just too little, we can't prove it, basically.
That's very interesting. Thanks so much. Stephen, I noticed you've got your hand up. Do you want to chip in?
Yeah, could I just ask a quick one to Francesca, linked to that? So you'd have thought, right, that the Historia would become the version of the First Crusade that's read in southern Italy. I just wondered if you had any sense as to why it didn't achieve a wider circulation. Is there something inherently deficient in the text itself that's responsible for that?
No, not at all. I mean, the text, as I said, I do think that a great injustice has been done to the way that this Historia de Via is written about. It's highly literary, it's very beautifully written, actually, and indeed, in itself, the Gesta Tancredi is very written very carefully. So I have to be very prudent about this, but I have a giant 50 pages article coming out in the Journal of Medieval History in February about this. I don't think that people in southern Italy are that interested in crusading. I think, if I had to tell you, that the perception in southern Italy is that crusading is something that people that pass through do, and that in southern Italy you do when you are following the Hautevilles. So you go crusading when the Hautevilles go to Outremer. And how much the Hautevilles think of it as crusading and how much of it they think of, and then we go and we conquer other things in the other place, is in itself a big question, which is not to say that there isn't anybody who is going on the pilgrimage, on the crusading pilgrimage. Indeed, there is a Hauteville cousin that may go at the turn of the century, William Tassio. He just decides that he wants to go and do this pilgrimage and sells lands not his own. Classic Hauteville behavior to finance it. But also, I think the thing that's quite important to keep in mind, again, I return to Bohemond's Mausoleum. In the rest of Europe, Bohemond is the hero of the First Crusade. You look at his mausoleum, and the poem that goes around his mausoleum says that he defeated Greece 3 times and then Parthia once, and then he conquered Antioch. And obviously we know that he has defeated Parthia and conquered Antioch as part of the First Crusade, but there's nothing about a pilgrimage in arms. There's nothing about Jerusalem. It's just a completely different way of perceiving it. I think the center of gravity remains firmly on southern Italy. And so the Monte Cassino Chronicle may think, oh, this is interesting that some people from southern Italy went there. And it is, I mean, the Monte Cassino Chronicle says explicitly, I compiled this narration in here because I thought it would be really interesting to talk about. But it's also very clear that this narrative of the First Crusade is very external to its focus, which is, after all, in southern Italy. Does that answer the question?
Thanks so much, Francesca. I think that probably answers the question. I don't know if Stephen was going to respond, but I've just noticed the time, and we're running a bit out of time, and we've got a question in the Q&A for Stephen. So I'll just read out that question, and also a comment from Matthew Bennett. So I'll read that out as well. And then once Stephen's answered the question, maybe I'll pass over to Antonella to wrap things up. So yeah, this question comes from Katie Mortimer. She says, thank you, Stephen, and could you speak further about why Crusade scholars have been slow to recognise the value of annals? Is this unique to the Third Crusade / memory of the Third Crusade, or across the board for the field? And just to add the comment from Matthew Bennett after that, he says, I'm enjoying the way the younger generation of scholars are using what might be called blended genres to develop a deeper understanding of the reception of crusading history, both close to the time of the events and for many centuries afterwards. Yeah, and I can echo my agreement with that. So yeah, Stephen, if you could answer that question, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you very much, Katie. So I think, so it's not unique to the Third Crusade, that's for sure. I think it stems from the fact that a traditional canon of Crusade sources, and primarily narratives, has been inherited from the 19th century. So a select few sources, the eyewitness texts, have garnered most of the attention. I think it probably also relates to the fact that annals can be really tedious and annoying to work with because they're so brief. But you know, annals are also really valuable for studying other Crusading expeditions, including the First Crusade. So the Coventry Chronicle that I mentioned has some quite interesting entries for the First Crusade. So the events that the annalists decided that were worth recording were the preaching of the Crusade, the capture of Nicaea and Antioch, and then the recovery or the finding of the Holy Lance, which surprised me, given that that discovery was, well, at least contested or disputed. So no, they have wider value for the study of the Crusades beyond the Third Crusade.
Great, thank you very much, Stephen. And I think it's probably time to wrap things up. So I just want to finish by saying thank you to all our speakers today. It's been a really interesting session. I've learned a lot, and it's been great to see what people are working on and how much sort of intersection there is in terms of the question of the memory of the Crusades. So thank you everyone for participating, and thank you for the questions as well. So I'll just hand over to Antonella, who can wrap things up.
Thank you very much. It was an excellent session, a very timely one. We finished at 7, so thank you all, and thanks Mike for chairing it. I'm sure there's been loads to think about, lots of food for thought, lots of new sources that a lot of us have found out more about tonight, and I hope that there will be more opportunities for us to gather together again, hopefully not even, and we'll I just would like to have a virtual round of applause for all our speakers tonight, and a reminder that the next webinar for the Society is next month, and we're going to send more information and the link to register soon. So take care, and thank you all very much for attending this session. See you soon. Bye.